By the mid-10th century, 100 years after the fall of the Tibetan Empire, the political and religious landscape surrounding the Tibetan Plateau had significantly changed. In the east, reeling from a catastrophic rebellion, the Great Tang Dynasty had fallen. Its territories were now engulfed in a time of upheaval and civil war known as the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. The great Turkic-speaking states to the north had also collapsed and were consolidating into a new East Asian empire, which made open war on the fractious Chinese kingdoms. In the distant west, the Abbasid Caliphate, suffering from a series of internal crises, had also lost control of its Central Asian colonies, which were formed into minor and unstable dynastic kingdoms. Finally, to the south, in the ancestral homeland of Buddhism, the northern Indian states faced a profound threat, an invasion by the Ghaznavid dynasty, a militant Islamic empire which had emerged in the highlands of the Hindu Kush and was rapidly expanding. In their wake, great Buddhist monasteries and centers of learning were looted and destroyed, causing a religious exodus and leading some Indian Buddhist patriarchs to look for new sources of patronage and potential allies. In the midst of this century of political and religious upheaval, nestled along a trade route in the quiet western Himalaya, there was a wealthy Tibetan kingdom that would soon emerge at the center of a Buddhist revival that would sweep across the plateau and change the role played by Buddhism in Tibetan society forever. Based in the monastic fortress city of Tsaparang, which controlled a strategic river valley and trade corridor between northern India and western Tibet, the Kingdom of Guge-Purang was founded in the early 10th century by an enigmatic figure named Tashigun. However, it was under the reign of his nephew, Lachen Yeshe O, the second king of Guge-Purang, that the kingdom attained its notoriety. Later Tibetan histories suggest that from an early age, Yeshe O was deeply interested in Buddhism, and after taking the throne as a child, he began to receive religious training, which culminated in the year 989 when he was fully ordained as a Buddhist monk. Combining both religious and political authority, and drawing from the kingdom's considerable wealth accumulated through the taxation of trade, Yeshe O financed a campaign to promote Buddhist learning and rebuild Western Tibetan monasteries, both of which were now in long decline. By the mid to late 10th century, the forms of Buddhism that were practiced in the Western Tibetan kingdom would have been dramatically different from the courtly high monasticism of the empire. In the absence of centralized monastic institutions and with limited access to Buddhist texts, which outline the correct performance of rituals, philosophy, and codes of conduct, over the course of the previous century, an eclectic variety of religious practices had developed across the plateau. According to Tibetan sources, Yeshe O and his ministers viewed these eclectic practices with enormous skepticism, not only doubting their authenticity, but going so far as to argue that they represented a degenerate form of Buddhism, which required urgent reform as well as institutions capable of instructing monks in the ancient traditions of monastic discipline and ethics. Lacking the resources to accomplish this in his kingdom, Yeshe O looked to the south for inspiration, and, like the emperors of old, began to send monk scholars to train in India, as well as to invite the great luminaries of Indian Buddhism to his court. In its early stages, this process of monastic exchange was fraught with difficulties. The roads were dangerous, and descending from the arid valleys of West Tibet, the heat of Indian jungles and tropical diseases posed further risk. Many young and talented Tibetan monks died in the crossing. However, those that survived succeeded in establishing contact with prominent monasteries across North and East India, and within the space of a generation, this contact grew into an extensive economic and religious collaboration. Soon, Western Tibetan scribes, some still famous today, began to train in Kashmir as translators and returned to Guge-Purang in caravans that were now loaded with Tibetan translations of priceless Indian Buddhist manuscripts. Libraries were built to house this new and growing wealth of knowledge, which included texts on medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, in addition to highly prized treatises on monastic discipline and law. Financed by Yeshe O's patronage, Kashmiri artisans, who were considered to be among the finest in the Buddhist world, were also invited to the Western Tibetan kingdom. Their painting and sculpture would contribute to the formation of a distinct Tibetan Buddhist artistic canon, the influence of which began to be felt in neighboring kingdoms. And as the reputation of Guge-Purang grew, it caught the attention of prominent Indian Buddhist leaders, some of whom, like the Bengali Buddhist master Atisha, accepted invitations to travel across Tibet, offering teachings, revitalizing monasteries, and taking on many new disciples who would later found influential monastic orders of their own. Meanwhile, as Buddhism began to experience a profound revival on the Tibetan Plateau, across the border to the south, Indian Buddhism was entering a period of steep decline. In the mid to late 11th century, the Islamic Ghaznavid dynasty was making significant territorial gains, and the sudden collapse of the Gurjara-Pratihara Empire, which had united much of North India for centuries, threw the region into chaos and civil war. This made it difficult for Buddhist institutions to find state patronage, and increasingly, they looked beyond the borders of the Indian states for financial support. Under those circumstances, Tibet, which despite its fragmentation was in a period of relative stability and peace, would have offered opportunities for Buddhist scholars that were no longer available in India itself. Over the course of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, other Tibetan territories followed in the example of Guge-Purang's success, and patronage of Buddhist figures from India, China, and Nepal became widespread. Tibetan records from the period show that, like the Kingdom of Guge-Purang, the clannish aristocracies of central and east Tibet were also engaged in extensive campaigns to refurbish and restore Buddhist monuments from the old empire, as well as construct ambitious new monasteries, each vying for the support of local patrons and the validation provided by the translation of ancient Buddhist texts that were previously unknown in Tibet. At the same time, monastic leadership became an increasingly common feature of state, as educated and often internationally minded monks became advisors to the powerful clans, or even rulers in their own right. The fabric of Tibetan society was changing. Following the civil strife of the collapse of the empire, the Tibetan landscape was now a patchwork of small, highly localized kingdoms and aristocratic estates, which shared alliances and were connected by lucrative trade routes, a shared language, and the emerging culture of Tibetan Buddhism. While the land was still politically divided, this period, known today as the Tibetan Renaissance, saw the re-emergence of clan and religious authority on the Tibetan Plateau, as well as renewed economic infrastructure, agriculture, and trade. And as Indian Buddhism continued to decline, Tibetan monasteries and their libraries came to be seen as storehouses of Indian Buddhist philosophy and history, as treasuries of knowledge that would preserve and define Buddhist learning for a millennium. But the history of Tibetan Buddhism itself is not without conflict, and it wasn't long before new Tibetan religious sects began to emerge as monastic orders divided over philosophical debates as well as old clannish animosities, and began to compete for the favor and patronage of Tibet's now Buddhist patriarchs and kings. In the coming century, these conflicts would erupt into open religious warfare and reshape the political landscape of the Tibetan Plateau. All the while, to the distant north, across the barren Gobi Desert, a storm was brewing in central Mongolia. An obscure warlord named Temujin, known today as Genghis Khan, would soon unite the Mongolian clans and embark on decades of conquest that would define the future of Asia for centuries. Thank you for watching. I'm Alex, the writer and director of the series, and I want to thank our backers on Indiegogo who helped finance this episode, and also our supporters on Patreon, all of these wonderful people right here. If you're interested in learning more about Tibetan history or the Tibetan Empire more specifically, you'll find all of our references in the video description, but you'll also find expanded reading lists, commentary, and annotated bibliographies for each episode on our Patreon, as well as interviews with specialists in Tibetan history and culture, like this interview with Professor Louis Donny at the University of Bonn, which covers the middle and late periods of the empire and provides much more depth than we were capable of covering in this episode. None of our Tibet-related content on Patreon is paywalled. It's all free to watch and free to use. But if you like what we're doing on the channel, please consider becoming one of our Patreon supporters to help us make more content like this in the future. But whatever you do, wherever you are, I hope you never stop learning.